Thus, the Americans in short order found themselves moving regiments and divisions to places that many US officers wouldn't have been able to find on a map just 6 months earlier. This led directly to the fourth American realization. If the Pacific was to be defended, the notion of a Germany-first strategy had to be flexible enough to accommodate the immediate needs of the Pacific. In practical terms, this meant that the prevailing notion of an invasion of the European continent as early as mid-1942 had to be put on ice. In hindsight, attacking Germany directly in 1942 was completely unrealistic in any case. Nevertheless, this temporary reordering of military priorities in favor of the Pacific represented a dramatic modification of pre-war strategy. The man upon whom command in the Pacific fell was Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet. Nimitz had taken charge on 31st December 1941 after the disgraced Admiral Husband E. Kimmel had been relieved following the attack on Pearl Harbor. Nimitz was by all accounts an excellent officer. Instead of sacking Kimmel's staff, his first act was to retain them amid assurances of his utter confidence in their abilities. This had the effect of steadying the morale of a command that had been badly shaken. Likewise, the new commander-in-chief was a sound judge of men, knowing who to promote and who to lateral into positions that better fit their abilities. He delegated authority easily and knew how to get the best out of his subordinates. Level-headed, Nimitz was apparently immune to panic and retained at all times a shrewd ability to assess odds and likely outcomes. His calculating nature was complemented, though, with boldness and an aggressive spirit. Nimitz was determined to destroy the main force of the Japanese Navy as soon as was practical, and he knew that his carriers would be the centerpiece of any such action. Even in the face of the near hysteria of the early war months, when the exploits of Japan's warriors had given them the aura of invincibility, Nimitz was confident that his sailors and aviators were fully the equal of their opponents. For the moment, though, Nimitz had little choice but to react to Japanese moves. He did not yet have anything resembling the material preponderance that he would need to win the war. He was outnumbered in fleet carriers, the Saratoga having been heavily damaged in January by an enemy submarine. The newer but smaller Wasp was still in the Atlantic. This left 4 carriers, Saratoga's sister ship, Lexington, and the Enterprise, Yorktown, and their newly commissioned sisters, Hip, Hornet, which had just reached the Pacific in March. Throughout the first months of the war, Nimitz gamely employed his carriers in a series of raids against exposed enemy outposts. Although these minor actions had little material impact on the war, they did have the positive effect of hardening the American carrier air groups. However, by April, reacting to pressure from Washington that the Navy do something positive to boost the morale of the American public, 2 of Nimitz's carriers participated in a far more audacious carrier raid, one that ultimately produced outsized results. On the morning of 18th April, just 2 days after Admiral Nagano had presented the Midway Plan to the Emperor, 16 American twin-engined medium bombers appeared as if by magic over Tokyo and half a dozen other cities. Commanded by Army Air Force Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle, these aircraft had been launched some 400 miles off of the Japanese coastline by the carrier Hornet. She, along with her consort Enterprise, had penetrated the Japanese defensive lines in much the same way that Japan had opened the war against the United States, by traversing the desolate wastes of the northern Pacific. Given the scarcity of carriers, Admiral Nimitz had been reluctant to authorize such an operation. But he had no choice but to comply with his superior's wishes and ordered the newly arrived Hornet to participate. At Alameda Air Station in California, Hornet had duly stowed Doolittle's B-25s on the after end of her flight deck and then set off directly across the Pacific for what the majority of her sailors thought was an aircraft ferrying mission. It was only after being joined by Vice Admiral William F. Halsey Jr.'s Enterprise in mid-ocean that the nature of the mission was fully revealed. Such a raid had not been unanticipated by the Imperial Navy. Ugaki had remarked on the danger of such attacks in his diary as early as 2nd February 1942. To safeguard against these threats, the Japanese had placed a ring of picket boats 700 miles off the shore of the home islands to detect the approach of enemy task forces. A pair of these sentinels had, in fact, sighted the American task force in time to warn Tokyo before being sunk by the Americans. However, the Japanese had not anticipated the American innovation of using longer-ranged army bombers launched from a carrier. Normally, an enemy flat-top would have been obligated to close to within about 200 miles, the extreme range of U.S. carrier-based aircraft, in order to attack. Upon being sighted, however, the Americans had simply let fly with their B-25s and then promptly headed for the exits. The Imperial Navy tried to redeem the situation. Coincidentally, Nagumo and his 5 carriers were making their way back to Japan from their raids against Ceylon when Doolittle attacked, and Akagi, SRIE, and Hyrie were sent charging eastward from Mako, Taiwan, in pursuit of the American flat-tops. But the Americans were not waiting around to receive Japanese retribution for their insolence. Akagi and company had found nothing but empty ocean, and were obliged to return to Hashirajima empty-handed. Strictly speaking, the military results of the Doolittle raid were so minimal as to be laughable. A few bombs sprinkled in desultory fashion over various targets and the light carrier Ryuho slightly damaged on the building ways in Yokosuka. But the psychological impact of the attack was enormous. Admiral Nagano, having personally heard the explosions in Tokyo, reacted to news of the attack with stunned disbelief, muttering, "This shouldn't happen. This just should not happen." Yamamoto took ill and retreated to his cabin for an entire day. Like all the Navy's upper command, he felt a deep obligation to safeguard the nation from attack. More particularly, the thought that the Emperor had been personally endangered filled Yamamoto with an unquenchable remorse. He knew, and his peers knew, that such a raid could never have materialized if the American carriers had been sunk outright in Hawaii at the beginning of the war. The fact that not a single American plane had been brought down by Japanese defenses only made the whole episode even more mortifying. This American pinprick had the effect of cementing the strategic debate in favor of Yamamoto and winning the army over regarding operations in the Central Pacific. Until the American carriers were safely in their graves, the homeland could never be completely protected from their attacks. After April 18th, their destruction had been raised to the status of an axiomatic good. The day after Doolittle's raid, General Tanaka privately told Captain Tomioka that he was rethinking his reservations regarding Operation MI. On the 20th, Tanaka not only formally approved of Operation MI, but also committed the army to supplying troops for the assault. Even more intriguing, he informally asked Tomioka for more details on Eastern Operation, which marked something of a watershed in the Army's appreciation for the scheme. The Army initially assented to Operation MI on the explicit understanding that it not be dragged into operations aimed at Hawaii. However, within a month, the Army had done an about-face on this matter too. On 25th of May, just days before the Nagumo force was slated to sail for Midway, the Army issued orders to several units to begin preparing for an amphibious attack against Hawaii. Training for the assault was to be completed by the end of September. Thus, against great odds, Yamamoto had achieved his goal operations in the Central Pacific, aimed at the destruction of the American fleet and the subsequent capture of Hawaii. It is necessary now to turn to an examination of Yamamoto's operational plan as it emerged in its final form, a task for which the reader would be well advised to pour a rather tall glass of spirits beforehand. The first order of business involves clarifying the exact relationship between the operations aimed at the Aleutians, AL, and those centered on Midway, MI. Western accounts of the battle have generally characterized Operational AL as being an elaborate diversion in support of Operation MI. According to this interpretation, AL was designed to lure the US fleet out of Pearl Harbor, such that it could be intercepted and engaged north of Hawaii as it moved to relieve the Aleutians. However, this rendering of Japanese intentions is incorrect. In fact, Operation AL was an entirely separate endeavour that was never designed to impact the conduct of operations around Midway. The debunking of the diversion myth is supported by numerous Japanese sources. Prominent among these are a pair of monographs prepared by Japanese naval officers for the military history section of U.S. Army Forces Far East immediately after the war. According to one of these reports, the April 5th compromise between Nagano and Yamamoto led to a revision of the operational plan to allow for conducting the Midway and Aleutian invasions simultaneously in early June, emphasis added. The second monograph confirms that Operation MI was to be carried out nearly simultaneously with the Aleutians operation. In neither of these monographs is mention made of Operation AL being a feint or diversion to be launched before Operation MI, or of its being intended to draw the Americans north out of Pearl Harbor. It's worth noting, too, that the main battleship groups for the two operations, Yamamoto's main body and Takasu's guard force, sortied together from Hashirajima and simply diverged thereafter. Admiral Nagumo's official report on the battle similarly makes no mention of the Aleutians operations being a diversion. Indeed, it doesn't describe the Aleutians as being related to the action off Midway in any way whatsoever. Similarly, the post-war interview of Commander Watanabe Yasuji Yamamoto's staff officer is completely silent on the topic. One would have supposed that such a prominent feature of the plan would have been pointed out by Watanabe, making this omission curious indeed. The interview of Admiral Nagano as well, despite Nagano's spurious disavowal of his staff's role in creating the Aleutians operational concept, makes no mention of AL being a diversion. Watanabe and Nagano, of course, were both present at the 2-5 April staff discussions that led to Operation AL's incorporation into the overall battle plan, and were clearly in a position to have pointed out this facet of the operations. The second objection to be raised is simply one of common sense. For a diversion to have lured the Americans from Pearl Harbor, an attack in the Aleutians would have needed to take place not one, but several days before the Japanese showed their hand at Midway. This was absolutely necessary in order to give the US fleet time to react to the perceived threat and begin steaming north to the Aleutians. Even had they responded quickly, on only a day's notice, the Americans would still have been well south of Midway when Nagumo attacked. Indeed, as will be shown, Yamamoto never considered that the enemy would move directly north toward the Aleutians. Rather, he envisioned US forces sailing west from Oahu and then giving battle to the southwest of Midway. This was hardly the course of action one would expect of a force being deliberately lured toward the Aleutians. The final piece of the puzzle is to be found in the Japanese official war history. In its final form, Yamamoto's plans all fundamentally revolved around N-Day, 7 June, Tokyo time, 6 June local, when Midway was to be invaded and captured. As mentioned, offensive operations would open several days beforehand, on day N3, 4 June Tokyo, 3 June local. On this day, as set forth in the original Japanese plan of operations, Dutch Harbour and Midway were both to have been attacked. Indeed, this was the plan up until shortly before Nagumo actually sailed. Thus, the idea of the Aleutians being a feint is clearly untrue. For the most part, Operation AL was simply an expedient land grab to be executed while the US Pacific Fleet was busy elsewhere. Its goal was to push Japan's defensive perimeter outward. More precisely, AL's object was to capture or demolish points of strategical value on the western Aleutian Islands in order to check the enemy's air and ship maneuvers in this area. By doing so, air and surface patrols would provide a perfect shielding opportunity for Japan. Potential incursion from the north and communication links between the United States and Russia would then be obstructed. This latter was a very important point, given the quantity of American supplies being sent to Russia via the Barents Sea. Furthermore, Japanese possession of the Aleutians was conceived as a flanking movement to protect Midway from a possible attack from the north once the island was secured. It is clear from the foregoing that the Japanese held an exaggerated opinion of the utility of the Aleutians as a possible path for launching either an invasion or strategic bombing attacks against the homeland. The weather conditions in the Aleutians, as the Japanese were shortly to discover, were routinely awful. The islands themselves, small, mountainous, and devoid of any ground cover or building materials, made the archipelago useless for staging any offensive action larger than an occasional narwhal hunt. Yet, such were the defensive goals with which the Japanese went forth. The second major clarification regarding AL regards how it was to unfold. Despite being almost a sideshow in comparison to the operations off Midway, Operation AL's order of battle was perhaps more complex than that of Operation MI. Yamamoto's plan considered 3 distinct phases of operation, each of which anticipated major reshufflings of the naval formations involved. This has the effect of greatly complicating any discussion of the anticipated movements of warships during the operation. The 3 phases, known as distributions, were detailed in Northern Naval Force Order No. 24, issued on 20th of May. Their goals and timing were as follows. The first distribution encompassed the initial approach to the objective and operations up to the point where the immediate landing objectives were achieved, i.e., approximately 8th of June 1942. The second distribution pertained to operations designed to consolidate Japan's hold on the area, and would continue until such time as the threat of counterattack by the enemy had been largely nullified. The third distribution defined reallocation of ships to guard the northern area. This was to be in effect by 20th of June 1942. The 3 distributions and their effects on the forces assigned to Operation AL are described in tabular format in Appendix 11. Yamamoto envisioned opening Operation AL with an attack on Dutch Harbour on 4th June, 3 days before the planned invasion of Midway itself. This would nullify American naval and air power at their only major base proximate to the western end of the Aleutians archipelago. Attacks would continue as needed, followed by landings on the islands of Kiska and Adak on the 6th. An optional landing on Attu was scheduled for the 12th. The landing at Adak was to be temporary, lasting only as long as it took to destroy the American facilities that were feared to be there. Although the capture of Dutch Harbour was not contemplated at this time, the Japanese felt it was important to secure bases from which patrols could be mounted against it. Doing so would forestall the feared development of Dutch Harbour as an air and submarine base that threatened the North Pacific. To accomplish these aims, an army force of 1,143 troops was slated to land on Attu and Adak, carried by a single transport. Guarding it would be light cruiser Abukuma, 4 destroyers, and a mine layer. Meanwhile, Kiska would be assaulted by 550 troops from the Navy's Maizuru 3rd Special Pioneer Force, known in the West as Special Naval Landing Forces, or SNLF, accompanied by a construction battalion. The Navy troops were to be carried in 2 transports guarded by the light cruisers Kiso and Tama and 3 destroyers, accompanied by an armed merchant cruiser and 3 minesweepers. Overall command of the Aleutians operation was to be vested in Vice Admiral Hosogaya Moshiro's Northern Force main body, which during the first distribution would consist of heavy cruiser Nachi, 2 destroyers, 2 oilers, and 3 supply ships. Also under Hosogaya's control was Rear Admiral Yamazaki Shigeaki's force of 6 submarines, which were to scout ahead of the landing forces and screen the surface forces behind them. The real striking power of the Aleutians operation was centred on Rear Admiral Kakuta Kakuji's 2nd Mobile Striking Force. Dainikid Butai bore a little resemblance to its more illustrious cousin. It consisted of Carrier Division 4, hereafter Cardiv 4, composed of the converted carrier Junyo, which had just been commissioned, and the light carrier Ryujo. They were an odd pair. Junyo was larger and had better aircraft handling facilities, but she was hampered by her low speed of 25 knots. This meant that she was not considered capable of operating torpedo aircraft, because in light wind conditions she wasn't fast enough to create the relative wind over her bow necessary to launch them, Kakuta's flagship, Ryujo, was faster, but she was plagued by small elevators, meaning that she could not operate the burly Type 99 dive bomber. Thus, neither of these ships was as useful as a true fleet carrier alone, and they were only marginally more useful in tandem. Kakuta's command was filled out by heavy cruisers, Takao and Maya, 3 destroyers, and an oiler. A small independent seaplane force, composed of the seaplane tender Kimikawa Maru and a destroyer, was responsible for cooperating with the landing operations, as well as locating enemy ships. In a similar vein, the 22nd Picket Boat Squadron would provide a defensive perimeter around the operation. The Aleutians Base Air Force, consisting of 4 transports and 6 large Type 97 flying boats from the Toko Air Group, would provide scouting support. In distant support of Kakuta's force was the Aleutians Screening Force under Vice Admiral Takasu Shiro, who hoisted his flag on battleship Hyuga. The core of his force was Bat Div 2, composed of Hyuga's sister ship, Isa, and the dowager battleships Fuso and Yamashiro. These were the 4 oldest battle wagons in Japan's inventory and were roughly equivalent to the aged American battleships sunk at Pearl Harbor. Screening these heavy units were light cruisers Kitakami and Oi and 12 destroyers. 2 oilers accompanied them. However, Takasu's dreadnoughts were not officially part of Operation AL and were only mentioned tangentially in the original Japanese planning documents. They would sail with Yamamoto's main body and thereafter place themselves in a position to provide support to the Aleutians forces if events warranted. Once the Aleutians were captured, the second distribution would bring about a large-scale reshuffling of Japan's warships. The Atuadak and Kiska invasion force would be dissolved and its vessels incorporated into other formations, notably the main body. This beefed-up unit would be retained for support of the entire Aleutian operation. Meanwhile, Kakuta's second mobile striking force would be augmented by light carrier Zoiho and a quartet of destroyers drawn from the various Midway forces. Kakuta's goal remained the same, the annihilation of any American vessels encountered. In support of this, the submarine force would be more than doubled by the addition of another 7 boats that had been under maintenance in Japan at the time the operational orders were issued, 20 May. The seaplane group, reinforced with Kamikawa Maru, again drawn from the Midway forces, would continue its scouting mission, as would the base air force. On both Kiska and Atu, the land forces would begin deploying for defence. The third distribution anticipated yet another major reshuffling, aimed at the long-term defence of the newly won territories. The main body would be reduced, though its support-oriented mission would remain. 2 new support formations would be formed, each centred on a pair of fast battleships from the Bat Div 3 and augmented by heavy cruisers and destroyers, in many cases newly released from the forces clustered around Midway. At the same time, Kakuta's second mobile striking force would be heavily reinforced and divided into 2 separate raiding groups. The first group would essentially consist of the forces he had begun the battle with Cardiff 4 and their escorts. Meanwhile, Zuiho would be split off into the second raiding group, joined by the Zuikaku, which was expected to be ready for operations by this time. Both raiding groups were to be under Kakuta's overall command. However, no specific missions for either group were defined, and it is difficult to see what these forces would have been able to accomplish in such latitudes. Operation AL's 3 distributions ultimately expected to call on the services of more than 80 vessels at one time or another, including 8 battleships out of the Imperial Navy's inventory of 11, 4 of her 11 carriers, and 13 submarines. By itself, the Aleutians' plan represented a larger commitment of forces than any operation the Japanese had embarked on thus far in the war. Far from being a sideshow, AL actually represented a sizable drain on the Imperial Navy's already scarce resources. It is interesting to note that nowhere in the Aleutians' battle plan was there apparently any provision for Kakuta's second striking force to be in any position to support Nagumo's operations to the south after its initial attacks against Dutch Harbour were concluded. If anything, the flow of forces was in reverse. in that many of the vessels slated for inclusion in AL's later phases were to come directly from the Midway forces. Indeed, some of them, including 4 destroyers from Nagumo's own screen, were scheduled to arrive soon after 8th June. Presumably these vessels would be detached and head northward immediately after the conclusion of operations in the vicinity of Midway. All in all, Operation AL reflected the larger problems inherent in Yamamoto's battle plan. It anticipated using widely separated forces and putting a great number of warships into northern waters, many of which weren't accomplishing anything terribly important. At the same time, AL's force structure for its later distributions actually anticipated siphoning off units that were being used near Midway, which was ostensibly the center of strategic gravity in the entire Pacific Ocean. These requirements directly contributed to the clockwork rigidity of the planning for Operation MI itself. It is difficult to escape the conclusion that all the time and energy that went into Operation AL might have been better spent focusing on operations to the south. Operation AL's flaws, though, paled in comparison to the errors Yamamoto would commit in his schemes aimed at Midway. Operation MI would begin at the same time that Kakuta opened his attacks on Dutch Harbour. N3 day, 4th June Tokyo time, 3rd June local. Nagumo's Force 6 fleet carriers, Cardivs 1, 2 and 5, 2 fast battleships from Batdiv 3, 2 heavy cruisers, and 11 destroyers with their light cruiser flotilla leader would approach Midway from the northwest. On the morning of the 4th, Tokyo time, Daiichi Kid Butai would be in position to strike. It was believed that a single attack would be sufficient to destroy the American airbase and its aircraft. The Japanese presumed that they would have the element of strategic and tactical surprise on their side, because offensive activities would be opened concurrently with Operation AL. Thus, Nagumo's carriers would simply sweep in unannounced and deliver a death blow against American air power on the island. Day N2, 5-4 June, would see additional airstrikes, with the Japanese turning their attention toward reducing the island's defences in preparation for the coming amphibious operation. While it was understood that Nagumo would have to deal with any American carriers that ventured north from Pearl Harbor to contest the Midway invasion, it was anticipated that the Americans would not be able to steam the distance between Hawaii and Midway in any less than 3 days. This being the case, Nagumo would only have to attend to one thing at a time. Nagumo's force would also use 10 of its Type 97 carrier attack planes for scouting purposes. Each of these aircraft would search out to a range of 400 miles to help provide early warning of the American fleet. Ground operations would begin on the morning of N1 day, 6-5 June. The Japanese would land on Cure Island, a tiny islet 60 miles west of Midway. Rear Admiral Fujita Ryutaro's seaplane tender group would secure this objective with a small contingent of troops. It was then to be put into operation as a seaplane base for use against Midway itself. On the morning of N-Day, 7-6 June, Midway would be assaulted by a mixed group of both Navy and Army units. The landing would be carried out by barge, known in the Imperial Navy as Daihatsu, each of which could carry about 100 soldiers as far as the reef. From there, the men would have to wade the remaining 200 or more yards through the lagoon and onto the beaches by foot. The Navy's 2nd Combined SNLF, consisting of some 1,500 soldiers, would be landed on Sand Island. Eastern Island would be invaded by the 1,000 men of Colonel Ichiki Kiyonao's regiment, named the Ichiki Detachment after its commander. Both forces would be landed on the southern shores of the islands, where the reef was less of an obstacle to amphibious movements. An additional landing on Sand Island's northwest corner was also planned if necessary. Accompanying the combat troops were 2 construction battalions, some of which were equipped with American construction material captured at Wake Island, and other auxiliary personnel necessary to repair Midway and turn it into a frontline airbase, bringing the total ground forces to over 5,000. The transports would also be hauling along 94 cannon, 40 machine guns, 6 Type A midget submarines, 5 motor torpedo boats, and all the accoutrements to develop Midway into a major outpost. Additional midget submarines, as well as land-based torpedo tubes and a dozen 20-cm guns, were slated for delivery in mid-June. In a fashion that was typical of Japan's inter-service cooperation, the Army troops would sail separately from Yokosuka, while the SNLF troops would sail from Kure. Both the Army and Navy had their own separate transports, and neither service was willing to accommodate the other aboard their own ships. Both private fleets would rendezvous at Saipan, and thereafter would sail together under the command of Rear Admiral Tanaka Raizo's transport group. This force consisted of the light cruiser Jintsu, 10 destroyers, 3 patrol boats, 12 transports, and several oilers. In relative proximity to Tanaka would sail Vice Admiral Kurita Takeo's close support group, which was centered on the 4 powerful heavy cruisers of Crew Div 7 Kumano, Suzuya, Mikuma, and Mogami. This quartet's 48-inch guns were to provide fire support for the landing. However, the Imperial Navy's raison d'etre was engaging enemy warships, not supporting landings. The Navy had never spent much time developing any sort of formal approach for spotting and coordinating gunfire ashore for troops. In hindsight, there is a very real question as to how effective Crew Div 7 would have proved to be in this role had it actually been put to the test. Kurita was accompanied by 2 destroyers and an oiler. Also near to hand, but sailing separately, was a minesweeper group consisting of 3 minesweepers, 3 subchasers, and an ammunition ship. Somewhat farther away would be the invasion force main body, under the command of Vice Admiral Kondo Nobutake. It consisted of the other 2 members of Bat Div 3 Hiei and Kongo under Rear Admiral Mikawa Gunichi. 4 heavy cruisers, Atago, Chokai, Haguro and Miyoko also accompanied the force. The screen for this powerful unit was commanded by Rear Admiral Nishimura Shoji aboard the light cruiser Yura, which led 7 destroyers. Also included in this group was the fine new light carrier Zuiho and her plane guard destroyer. All 3 of these formations, Tanaka's, Kondo's and Kurita's, were to approach Midway from the west-southwest. Midway was scheduled for capture on the 6th, local time, leaving a day for the base to be put back into operation in advance of the expected sea battle with the Americans. During this time, Nagumo's carriers would be supporting the invasion and simultaneously moving to the northeast of the island in preparation for the naval battle. His force was expected to be in position to support Kondo from the north-northwest by the end of the 6th. Kondo, for his part, would keep his battleships ready to deliver backup fire support against Midway if stiff resistance was encountered. The backstop to both Kondo's and Nagumo's forces was Yamamoto himself and his main body. Centered on Bat Div 1 Yamato, Nagato and Mutsu, this force contained the largest guns in the fleet. It was to follow behind Nagumo during the initial phase of the operation. Within this force would be several smaller formations that could maneuver independently if need be. One of them, the Special Group, consisting of seaplane tenders Chiyoda and Nishin, which were carrying midget submarines and motor torpedo boats, respectively, to reinforce Midway once it was captured. The second special formation, the Carrier Group, consisted of the ancient light carrier Hosho. Around all of the elements of the main force would be Rear Admiral Hashimoto Shintaro's screening force, consisting of light cruiser Sendai and 8 destroyers. 3 oilers accompanied the group. Once Midway was secured, the main body would be in position to support Kondo should the need arise. It was strongly believed that after 6 months of war, the Americans were now sufficiently weakened and demoralized that they would only sortie from Pearl Harbor with some coaxing. Kondo was the bait. Among other things, his flotilla contained a pair of capital ships, Hiei and Kongo, which made it a force worth attacking. At the same time, his 2 battleships were fast enough to extricate themselves from trouble if need be. Yamamoto apparently did not want to tip his hand by revealing his main body too soon, in the belief that such a massive array of firepower would induce the Americans to stay home. In other words, Yamamoto's dispersal of forces was purely an attempt at deception. His killing force would not enter scouting range of Midway until after the Americans had themselves sortied from Pearl. In a way, his plan was almost reminiscent of the usage of cruiser forces by both the German High Seas Fleet and the Royal Navy in World War I to lure the enemy into range of the main battle squadrons. Not surprisingly, having current intelligence on the American units that would presumably be walking into the trap was crucial to the operation's success. Yamamoto would be aided in these efforts by a special mission designed to assess the status of the American fleet at Pearl Harbor. Referred to as Operation K, the Japanese would employ flying boats operating out of the islands of Jaluit and Wotje to overfly the American fleet base on 31st of May, just before the commencement of the fleet actions. Kawanishi Type 2 four-engined flying boats had performed this same mission twice before in early March. On the first occasion, a heavy overcast on 3–4 of March had made reconnaissance impossible. During the second, on 9–10 of March, American fighters from Midway had intercepted and destroyed the Japanese plane. Yet, despite the negative results from these two missions, not to mention the evidence that this particular gimmick might be wearing a bit thin, Yamamoto didn't waver from trying a third time. The catch to Operation K was that no Japanese aircraft, even the big Kawanishis, had the range to fly all the way to Pearl Harbor and back without refueling. A flying boat, however, could make good this deficiency by stopping at some secluded place along the way to refuel. The chosen stopover had been an uninhabited islet known as French Frigate Shoals, which lay between Midway and Hawaii. In March, the Navy had used a submarine there to refuel the Kawanishis, which then proceeded to Hawaii. The same approach was to be used again on 31st May. In addition to aerial reconnaissance, 2 picket lines of submarines would be positioned across the presumed line of advance of the Americans. The southern cordon, A, and northern cordon, B, were each composed of 7 fleet boats. However, the submarines of both groups were assigned fixed positions, rather than being placed in patrol boxes in which they could operate freely. Worse, the patrol lines did not have overlapping fields of vision, making them porous indeed. This static mode of employment, which was typical of Japanese submarine operations throughout the war, meant that the big Imperial Navy boats could not be concentrated on enemy units with anything like the flexibility that the Germans were currently employing in the Atlantic. The decisive battle, as Yamamoto envisioned it, would be fought somewhere off Midway, with the main Japanese forces arrayed so as to intercept the oncoming Americans. After pounding Midway, Nagumo would withdraw and wait some 500 miles north-northeast of Midway, with Yamamoto's main body supporting him 300 miles to the west. Takasu's battleship force would come down from its position in the North Pacific to hover 500 miles north of Yamamoto. Second Mobile Striking Force, with its 2 carriers, would perform a similar maneuver to position itself 300 miles to the east of Takasu. Kondo's force would supply the bait to draw the Americans out of hiding at Pearl Harbor and lure them north, with the Japanese heavy forces lurking out of range of American reconnaissance aircraft and submarines. If all went according to plan, the Americans would appear off Midway after the landings had taken place. Yamamoto presumed that the Americans would sortie west from Oahu and then head north so as to be able to ambush the exposed Kondo as he trailed his coat near the island. Interestingly, it appears that Combined Fleet's opinion was that the Americans would bring not only their carriers, but also their few remaining battleships to the fray. It was further assumed that the carriers would operate separately from their battleship-centric main body, screening them from the west-northwest. This was a fairly doctrinaire interpretation of how the Americans would maneuver their forces, with the carriers presumably governed by the movements of the slower battleship force operating in the rear. In other words, it assumed that the Americans thought their battle squadrons were capable of making a meaningful contribution to a modern carrier battle, as Yamamoto believed his own could. In this, the Japanese were projecting their own beliefs on their opponent, a classic failing of many military plans. Having manufactured roles for their own battleships, the Japanese believed that the enemy would do likewise. However, what the Japanese couldn't know was that the Americans had by now totally discarded the idea of using their older battle wagons in conjunction with fast carriers. Yamamoto had only himself to blame for this radical transformation of American naval thought, as his triumph at Pearl Harbor had demonstrated unequivocally to his enemies the total vulnerability of such forces in the face of modern air power. Once the Americans were detected, Takasu's battle group would move south to join Yamamoto. On the eastern flank, Nagumo would move south to engage the American fleet as well. It was expected that attrition from the submarines, coupled with airstrikes from the carriers, would weaken the Americans sufficiently that they could be engaged and annihilated by the Japanese battleships. In a sense, Yamamoto's plan represented a curious reversion to a more gunpower-oriented philosophy, relegating Nagumo's carriers to an attritional role on par with the submarine force. Taken together, Operations AL and MI represented the commitment of almost the entirety of the Imperial Japanese Navy, all of its carriers, all of its battleships, all but 4 of its heavy cruisers, and the bulk of its lesser combatants. 28 admirals would lead these forces into battle, and they would log more miles and consume more fuel in this single operation than was normally used in an entire year. It was planned that once the battle was won, Nagumo's carriers would retire to Truk between 16 and 20 June. The battleships would return to home waters or head north to assist Operation AL. Thereafter, operations would be launched to consolidate the fruits of victory. Truk would be the jumping-off location for further planned incursions into the Southwest Pacific, with New Caledonia, Fiji and Samoa slated for occupation in July. In other words, in the interval between 5th of April, when Admiral Nagano had acceded to Yamamoto's plans, and the Southwest Pacific had been ostensibly removed from consideration, and early May, when the detailed battle plan was to be wargamed, Naval GHQ's preferred strategic option had once again been reintegrated into the Navy's overall strategic plan, albeit as a follow-on operation. August was to see the occupation of Johnston Island, as well as the first invasions of the Australian landmass itself. Last to go would be Hawaii, now shorn of any sort of mobile support, and increasingly isolated by Japanese outposts. It was a breathtaking vision indeed, yet its grandeur was betrayed by fundamental flaws in planning. Readers may be pardoned at this juncture if they are somewhat dizzied by the array of geographic objectives, formations, admirals and ships that paraded through the schemes for Operations AL and MI. Indeed, this is the first and most obvious drawback to the plan drafted by Kuroshima and ratified by Yamamoto. It was almost incomprehensibly complex. More than a dozen different surface formations and numerous groups of submarines were expected to participate in this tightly scripted operation. However, the expectation that these formations could coordinate their actions in such a fashion was ill-founded. Byzantine intricacy was a trademark of pre-war Japanese naval strategy. Fleet exercises often featured exquisitely coordinated maneuvers on the part of the Imperial Navy being met with conveniently inept countermoves by the oafish Americans, who never failed to go lowing obediently to their choreographed slaughter. Yamamoto, far from having steered his way clear of this strategic dreamland, had instead erected a monument to it. He concocted a plan that dissipated his own superiority of numbers, such that the essential core of the operation, the neutralization of Midway, was to be performed by a mere 22 warships. This was about 1/10 of the total number of vessels he envisioned scattering across the breadth of the Pacific in pursuit of various objectives, many of which were completely irrelevant to the success or failure of the centerpiece of the plan. The Aleutians operation stands at the top of this list of frivolous goals. By anyone's measure, the reduction of Dutch Harbour was a poor excuse to send the 50-odd warships of the first distribution to the North Pacific. In light of the fact that Operation AL was not even intended as a feint, it is difficult to understand devoting any resources to such a strategic irrelevancy. If the American carriers were destroyed off of Midway, then the Aleutians could be captured at will. If Nagumo failed, however, then in the long run the Aleutians could not be defended even if captured. As it developed, Attu and Kiska were to be the trifling consolation prizes for the failure of Operation MI. Their loss meant almost nothing to the Americans. Indeed, when he was informed of Attu's fall after the Battle of Midway had already transpired, U.S. Navy Secretary W. Frank Knox offered a pithy indictment of Yamamoto's plan by remarking that Japan was either unable to understand modern war or not qualified to take part in it. It must be emphasized that blame for this strategic faux pas must be shared by not only Yamamoto, but by naval GHQ as well. It was GHQ that appended the Aleutians concept to Yamamoto's offensive as the price for his ill-won gains in the realm of planning prerogative. If Yamamoto's downstream planning was flawed, Admiral Nagano and company had only themselves to blame for demanding that he throw good assets at a fundamentally bad idea. Yamamoto, though, apparently didn't put up much of a fuss at the notion, such was his confidence in his ability to beat the Americans. The larger issue of dispersal of Japan's forces, of which Operation AL was only a symptom, has, of course, been minutely examined in earlier histories of the battle. Certain points bear repeating here, though. As was mentioned, the prevailing opinion within Combined Fleet, and a belief that Yamamoto apparently shared, was that the American fleet was a beaten, demoralized outfit that would need to be coaxed toward its own annihilation. The corollary to this was that the need for deception outweighed the need for placing forces where they could be mutually supporting. Only by using deception would Yamamoto be able to bring his array of warships to battle without spooking the Americans into remaining in Hawaii. In this age of unquestioned American military hegemony, it is difficult to understand how any nation could have characterized the U.S. Navy in such a fashion. Yet, it must be remembered that in 1942, Japan had only a very limited context for judging the character of America's fighting forces. Indeed, in Japan's two previous wars against the Chinese and Russians, it had been up to the Japanese to precipitate many of the naval encounters, despite being the underdog. The Imperial Navy was thus used to being the aggressor against reluctant opponents. The first 4 months of the Pacific conflict had confirmed certain aspects of this Japanese self-image. The Allies had been handed an unbroken string of defeats since the inception of hostilities. If their bravery was not in question, it was apparent to all that their equipment, doctrine and training were in many ways not equal to Japan's. And while American morale had never broken, there was no question that American military prowess to date had been somewhat lacking. Given the beating the U.S. Navy had taken thus far, it was hardly surprising that the Japanese might have thought the Americans would be reluctant to fight them on the high seas. Faced with such a foe, Yamamoto might well have thought that he was emulating the ancient Chinese military sage Sun Tzu's 9th maxim concerning weaknesses and strengths. By making his dispositions subtle and insubstantial, the expert leaves no trace. Divinely mysterious, he is inaudible. Yamamoto would have been well advised to read ahead to the chapter's 13th maxim, which his opponent Nimitz would adroitly use to destroy him in the coming days. If I am able to determine the enemy's dispositions while at the same time I conceal my own, then I can concentrate and he must divide. And if I concentrate while he divides, I can use my entire strength to attack a fraction of his. This points to the first in the catalogue of Yamamoto's flaws as a commander, his inability to correctly fathom the true nature of his enemy. He had already failed in this regard once before, at Pearl Harbor. There, his passion for disabling the American fleet with a swift strike at the outset of hostilities had blinded him to the fact that attacking Hawaii by surprise would guarantee the implacable hatred of America. Now, during the planning for Midway, he likewise failed to discern the moral character of the enemy and its willingness to fight. Had Yamamoto correctly gauged the will of his foe, he might have realized that what was called for was less subtlety and more in the way of brute strength. Yamamoto then compounded this error by creating unnecessary subsidiary missions within the overall battle plan. One cannot fail to get the impression that many of the forces involved in both AL and MI seem to have been put there almost out of a simple desire to find something for them to do. In fact, this may not be far from the truth. Admiral Ugaki remarked in his diary on 3rd March that he feared that the morale of the main body is stale after a long stay in home waters. I have encouraged them, but we must engage in some operational action. Given this situation, Yamamoto may well have felt that make work was better than no work at all. Yet of the 11 battleships deployed, only the 4 fast battleships in Nagumo's and Hond's forces would actually be providing any real support to the crux of the operation. And as it developed, Cond's pair would never really be involved in any meaningful way. This left the 7 remaining slower battle wagons to provide distant cover for other groups. This was neither the first nor last time that the notion of distant cover would rear its misshapen head in Japanese battle planning. Indeed, it plagued their operations throughout the war. As it turned out, distant too often meant non-existent, in that the forces meant to be covered were too remote to be succoured when needed. This had very nearly proven the Japanese undoing at the Battle of Java Sea in March, where a Japanese cruiser force supporting an invasion convoy had been caught out of position by an Allied squadron. Only the speediness of Japan's cruisers had saved the day, allowing them to make up time on their slower charges. Likewise, the same notion of distant cover was to cost them the services of the light carrier Shoho in the not-too-distant future. It would be tempting to point to the Aleutians Force main body as being another poster child for this concept. Hosogaya's anorexic formation, whose warships were outnumbered by non-combatant vessels, 5-3, could barely fend off an attack on itself, let alone pull anyone else's bacon from the fire. However, it must be recalled that according to the first distribution of Operation AL, the main body was little more than a placeholder for a larger force that would come into being in the second distribution. Takasu's Aleutians screening force, centred on Bat Div 2, was perhaps a more appropriate target for this criticism. With the 4 oldest battleships in the Japanese inventory covering the 2 misfit carriers of Daini Kid Butai, Takasu's force could not by itself provide a credible threat to any American carrier task force that somehow ranged into northern waters. Nor, with a top speed of around 24 knots, could it run away quickly enough to save itself should the wolf show up at its own doorstep. Had he encountered American carriers, Takasu would have suffered the same fate as the Pearl Harbor battleships, the only difference being the greater depth and lower ambient temperature of their respective watery graves. Of course, it was Yamamoto's intention that they never be brought to battle in northern waters at all. The fact that Takasu's group was not even administratively attached to Operation AL in a formal manner reinforces this impression. It is difficult to understand why Yamamoto didn't simply put Takasu's battle wagons in the main body and have done with. As it was, Takasu was poorly positioned to unite with the main body when the main battle began. The fact that Takasu was hundreds of miles north necessarily limited Yamamoto's speed of reaction if and when the Americans were detected. Should the Americans deviate from their script, Yamamoto might be forced to go into battle without Bat Div 2's gunpower. By standing equidistant between 2 friendly forces, Takasu in essence supported neither. Yamamoto's own main body, despite its much heavier gunpower, lay in a similarly poor position to provide support if called upon. With at least 600 miles between him and Nagumo's fleet carriers, according to the original plan, he would be at least 2 days steaming away from any trouble they might run into. However, in Yamamoto's mind, the likelihood of this was low. Nagumo's opponent in the opening round of the battle would be solitary and static, namely Midway Island. Obviously, dictating the range to an island was much easier than doing the same with an enemy task force. If Nagumo got in trouble, he could always fall back on the main body. Midway wasn't going anywhere. Not surprisingly, many post-war commentators have criticized Yamamoto's placement of the main body relative to Nagumo. However, the remedy proposed by these same commentators, the direct integration of the main body with the striking force, would actually have made little operational sense, even if Yamamoto had decided to dispense with subtlety. Yamato, at 27 knots the fastest of the main body's 3 battleships, would perhaps have been able to keep up with Kid Butai during a battle, although she was a full knot slower than the slowest carrier in the group, Kaga. However, Nagato and Mutsu were 2 knots slower than Yamato and almost 10 knots slower than Hairi and S. Rai. As such, they would have been more of a hindrance than a help in any situation where the ability to maneuver rapidly was called for. Thus, direct integration of the 2 forces was not the right answer. Had direct support of Nagumo's carriers with heavy gunfire been needed, it would have made much more sense to have maintained the main body as a separate formation, but also to have kept it close to Nagumo. Yamamoto could have trailed Nagumo at a short distance, so as to be partially shielded by Nagumo's own combat air patrol, CAP, from American air attacks coming from the island. Alternately, and more boldly, the main body could have been placed in advance of the carrier force, providing the Americans with a tempting target, and thereby providing an air power sump for the enemy. All of these musings, however, miss the real point. In truth, supporting Nagumo was strictly secondary to the main body's intended mission of destroying the American fleet during the later stages of the battle. This, in turn, points to a central truth about Yamamoto's planning. If the premise is accepted that the Americans would have to be lured from Pearl Harbor in order to create the needed battle, there was no way to construct an operational plan whose distribution of warships was both deceptive and mutually supporting. The 2 goals were antithetical. Yamamoto knew he couldn't have it both ways, and he willingly sacrificed mutual support to the perceived need for stealth. In a very real sense, this one assumption about the nature of the enemy doomed the battle plan from the start. Notwithstanding Yamamoto's penchant for strategic deception, the arrangement of the various invasion forces approaching from the southwest is also difficult to understand. All were ultimately intended to arrive at roughly the same time off of Midway, albeit with Cond's more powerful group heading up the van during the final approach. Thereafter, Cond would head southeast without his weaker charges. For all this labour, all 4 groups could just as easily have sailed together from either Saipan or Truk and spared themselves the difficulty of coordination while simultaneously providing a greater degree of mutual protection. Likewise, directly incorporating the 4 fast, powerful cruisers of Crew Div 7, Mogami, Kumano, Suzuya and Mikuma, into Nagumo's force would have greatly increased his odds of success at little increased risk. Operating directly with Kid Butai, Crew Div 7 could have contributed greatly enhanced anti-aircraft and surface gun power during the actual battle, and still have been easily detached to bombard Midway when the time came. More important, the dozen or so long-range scout aircraft carried by these cruisers would have improved Nagumo's scouting capabilities immensely. Including Crew Div 7 would have made it possible to more than double the number of scout aircraft that were fated to be used on the morning of 5th of June, and commensurately increased the number of aircraft in reserve for following up enemy contacts. Clearly, too, stripping Crew Div 7 from the immediate vicinity of Tanaka's invasion convoy hardly exposed the latter to greater danger, as Kid Butai was the final guarantor of its safety in any case. A commander's job is to orchestrate and direct the 3 major dimensions of combat space, time, and force. From the preceding remarks, it can be seen that Yamamoto's plan failed to address the concept of space in a flexible manner. In his attempt to be divinely mysterious, he had rendered much of his fleet purposeless through dispersion. Many of his forces were positioned in such a way that they could accomplish nothing more meaningful than parading about in the Pacific in lieu of fighting. If they were called on to react to unforeseen developments, they could not do so. What, then, of the other 2 dimensions, time and force? In these as well, Yamamoto's plan suffered from alarming deficiencies. Nagumo's schedule required him to begin subduing Midway on the 4th, support landings on Kure on the 6th, followed by more landings on Midway on the 7th, and then be ready to fight a major fleet engagement immediately thereafter. In the course of these operations, Cure was to be placed in operation as a seaplane base within a day of its capture, and Midway restored to fighting order the day after that, to be ready to support Nagumo on the 8th. This was, to put it mildly, cutting things a little fine. Cure Island would have been relatively easy to put back into service. Seaplanes require less in the way of facilities for operation, but Midway's airstrip was a completely different matter. Given that Nagumo was to conduct air raids against it from the 4th through the 6th, it hardly seemed likely that the strip would be captured intact or even in working order. This was doubly true if Crudiv 7's guns were actually needed to support the landing operations. The Americans could also be expected to sabotage whatever they could before the island's capture. At the very least, the aviation fuel stores would be torched, and without them, there would be no flight operations from Eastern Island. All in all, despite construction workers accompanying the combat troops, the odds of Midway being transformed literally overnight into a workable base were remote. In addition, by the very strictures of the timetable being imposed on him, Nagumo's freedom of movement was grossly degraded. There was little possibility of his being able to meet unforeseen contingencies while still maintaining the strict tempo of operations the plan called for. No admiral would want to see his options limited in this fashion. Worse yet, the tight timing of Yamamoto's plan was predicated on the belief that the Americans were unaware of Japanese intentions. If that precondition did not hold up, Nagumo's might be in trouble. And despite all the power arrayed around him in distant support, he would be essentially on his own to deal with whatever problems arose. However, with 6 carriers, Nagumo was assumed to have the capability to deal with any American force that appeared. Freedom of movement would simply be compensated for by superior numbers of aircraft. This, then, was the linchpin upon which the entire operation hung: force. For all of Yamamoto's defective planning, his obsession with concealment and deception, shotgun approach to objectives, frivolous distribution of assets, and rigid timetable. His operational scheme could probably still have been made good so long as he retained his final trump card, a fully constituted Kid Butai, with all 6 of its fleet carriers. In the final analysis, since no one was in a position to support them anyway, these were the only ships in the entire operation that really mattered. But with 6 flat tops at hand, it would have been difficult for Nagumo to lose. The Americans would have been hard-pressed to assemble sufficient numbers of aircraft to oppose them, even with Midways thrown into the mix. The 3 Japanese carrier divisions between them would bring more than 350 planes into the battle, the equivalent of about 5 American carriers. It was known that the Americans could barely match that number of flight decks in April 1942, even if WASP were in the Pacific. Even in the unlikely event that the Americans were able to bring all their carriers together, they had never operated them as a group before, whereas the Japanese had extensive experience fighting together as a unit. As long as this final variable in the equation held up, Nagumo would have been in a very good position to emerge victorious. However, shortly after having won the April staff battles, Yamamoto had altered his basic operational designs in a way that jeopardized his final trump card, apparently as yet another quid quo pro to the Naval General Staff for his having run roughshod over them. Yamamoto agreed to lend significant naval support to 4th Fleet's plans for operations in the Southwest Pacific. Admiral Inoue was still determined to capture Port Moresby in New Guinea, as was Naval GHQ. Yamamoto wasn't in favour of Operation MO, as it was known, but he reasoned that if Port Moresby were captured in early May, whatever carriers were used, there could still be returned in time for Nagumo's complete force to be reassembled in home waters by mid-May. If so, they could still sally forth on Nagumo's designated sortie date for Midway, which had been set for 26th May. At first, Combined Fleet was of a mind to send just Kaga southward. Having missed the Indian Ocean operation because of the need to repair hull damage suffered in a mooring incident in Palau, she was already in home waters and had just been refitted. This would give Inoue a total of about 1.5 carriers, since he already had the brand-new light carrier Esh H under his command. Inoue, however, raised strenuous objections to this. The Japanese did not know that the Americans had used 2 fleet carriers in their 10-march raids against Leh and Salamaua. They suspected that they had been attacked by a combination of Saratoga's air group and land-based air operating from Australia. However, whatever the makeup of the enemy's forces, it was apparent that the Allies now had substantial air forces in the area. It was unlikely that the veteran Kaga and a rookie lightweight like Sheikh H could face up to serious opposition if it should materialize again. As a result, Combined Fleet relented, and on 12th of April issued orders telling Cardiff 5 to proceed via Mako to Truk at the termination of their Indian Ocean sortie. They would be ready to participate in Operation MO thereafter. Yamamoto reasoned that Shikaku and Zuikaku probably couldn't get themselves into too much trouble by participating in Inoue's sideshow, and might even garner some additional training in the process. In the event, they got quite a bit more than they bargained for. The utter illogic of Yamamoto's 12th April decision has been commented on before, but it bears repeating here. By any rational standard, it was absolutely essential to have Cardiff 5 in Nagumo's force if it was to be assured of material superiority at Midway. In effect, the feasibility of Operation MI now depended on whether or not Operation MO came off without Cardiff 5, suffering significant losses. Taking this gamble was a huge mistake, as it held the more important of the 2 operations hostage to the subordinates' success. What this suggests is that Yamamoto had not so much won the right to set the Navy's strategy as simply to have his plan go first, and even then with provisos. In effect, none of the competing strategic options that he had supposedly suppressed had actually been removed from the mix. They had merely been shoved to the end of the line in terms of timing. Though no one in the fleet would have been willing to admit it, Cardiff 5, despite its relatively junior status, represented Japan's current margin of superiority over the American Navy. No more real fleet carriers were slated to be delivered to the Navy until Taihei-Eish, then building, was completed in 1944. In other words, the Japanese carrier force was fixed for the foreseeable future. The Japanese believed they currently outnumbered the US Navy 11 carriers, 6 heavy and 5 light, to 6, 5 heavy and 1 light. If the Imperial Navy was to preserve for itself the freedom of action that had thus far characterized its operations, it was essential to also conserve its numerical superiority, particularly in heavy carriers. Every senior Japanese officer knew that this current numerical ascendancy was bound to be transient. The Americans were known to have more than a dozen Essex-class fleet carriers building, in addition to several light fleet units comparable to H and Zui. Japan could not hope to match this output. Therefore, Japan's naval leadership needed to manage its window of opportunity so as to maximize the utility of its assets while this superiority lasted. Such was Japanese confidence in the proficiency of their military, though, that they apparently felt no pangs of uncertainty in committing Cardiff 5 to the south.